The men you see are part of one of Russia's elite airborne units, about to be dropped into Hostomel Airport, just north of Ukraine's capital. Men from several airborne units like this were loaded up into helicopters for what they were told was a training mission in neighboring Belarus. 30 minutes before their jump point, they were instructed that they would be invading Ukraine instead of the planned training mission and expected to capture this fundamental airfield. Soldiers across from each other saw the blood drain from their buddies' faces as the reality set in. Now, over 1 year later, the units involved in these strikes, the cream of Russian airborne forces, have been decimated to the point where their input in the war since has been trivial. Since the 1930s, Russia and its Soviet predecessors have put significant effort into airborne forces. Whereas in the US and most NATO countries, airborne and air assault units have generally been a part of the army. In 1956, Russia rolled its entire airborne corps into its own branch, the VDV, dedicated to parachute and air assault operations. Seen by the Russians as being a more elite version of their infantry forces, they pushed money and resources into the organization. During the Cold War, the Soviet war plan against NATO relied on making quick and decisive thrusts into Europe to make tactical nuclear weapons a costly exercise in self-harm, and the importance placed on the VD demonstrated how Russia planned to achieve this. The birth and employment of the VDV is a microcosm of what went wrong in Russia's initial excursion into Ukraine. The use of the VDV was based on a Soviet military theory known as deep battle. This concept was developed in the 1920s and 30s and was revolutionary. It relied on utilizing combined arms to directly engage the enemy's front, and then using fast-moving and mobile units like its airborne corps to exploit breakthroughs and drive deep into enemy lines to disrupt the rear. In Ukraine, this theory was put into action with the idea that Russian airborne troops would push far ahead of the front line of advance of the army and capture Hostomel Airport, securing a runway large enough to bring in cargo planes full of troops, supplies, and mechanized units. However, vague tactical notions, unrealistic assessments of success, self-sabotage, and internal backstabbing from Russia's intelligence organizations would eventually lead to the death and dismemberment of the men dropping into Ukraine that day. Regardless of how one feels towards Russia, it is quickly apparent that, like in many nations, politicians and generals are more than willing to gamble with the lives of others when their feet won't be touching the tarmac. Shortly after Vladimir Putin ordered his special military operation into Ukraine, the VDV started their assault on Hostomel. At 8 in the morning, 20 to 34 Russian helicopters conducted an air assault on the airport. Mi-8 transport helicopters dropped troops directly onto the tarmac, where they quickly attempted to establish a perimeter and push the Ukrainian defenders out. Hostomel is a vital airfield located just 10 kilometers from Ukraine's capital and acted as the home runway for the world's largest plane and elements of Ukraine's Air Force. Ukraine was pre-warned by the CIA about Russia's plans to conduct the invasion. However, they could only muster around 300 under-equipped, untested troops to defend the strategic location. Sources inside the Ukrainian and Russian governments have indicated that this may have been in part due to internal dissension sown by Russia's security agencies in the days leading up to the war in hopes of hindering the Ukrainians' defense. Indeed, some Ukrainian air defenses at the airport were precisely hit by attack helicopters early in the conflict, which Ukrainian intelligence has indicated was the result of a spy paid by Russia. Additionally, defenders were blocked from securing the location until just the day before the invasion due to the non-compliance of Antonov State Enterprise leadership, which has been suggested to be part of Russia's pre-war destabilization effort. Following Russia's initial success in repealing the 300 defenders, local Ukrainian civilians and the 3rd Special Purpose Regiment of Ukraine Special Forces harried the Russian forces, preventing them from securing a beachhead. MiG-29s from Ukraine's 40th Tactical Aviation Brigade and ground-based Igla anti-aircraft systems provided a significant threat to Russian aircraft, with reports that at least 3 helicopters were shot down. This, combined with the stalling actions from Ukrainian special and conventional forces, made it impossible for Russian Il-76 transport planes to land on the runway. A Ukrainian counterattack was launched by the 4th Rapid Reaction Brigade of Ukraine's National Guard, the Georgian Legion, and Ukrainian air assault forces, which managed to push the Russian paratroopers into the forest surrounding the airfield. The indirect fire caused significant casualties to the Russians and made the airport inoperable. The stalling action made it possible to prevent a rapid decapitation effort into Ukraine's capital by Russia and kept Ukraine in the war. The Russian Ministry of Defense claimed 200 Ukrainian casualties, with no losses on the Russian side. This is contradicted by reports from a Russian VDV paratrooper from the 31st Brigade. During an interview with Ukrainian media, Ponomarev stated that equipment and reinforcements were expected to arrive within 24 hours. Still, without significant reinforcements, they were left to fend for themselves for at least 3 days. He said indirect fire devastated their force, destroying dozens of soldiers and equipment. There was nothing left, not even a turret, he said. Almost nobody survived that day. Independent media indicated that between February 25 and March 7, 34 paratroopers from the VDV's 31st Brigade were killed. Russian mechanized forces would eventually capture the airfield and push the Ukrainian defenders out. Still, the engagement was devastating, with the airborne forces' role in the conflict being mostly relegated to a supporting role. The 31st was pushed immediately into the towns surrounding Hostomel and the encirclement of Kyiv. They were finally withdrawn after Russia's retreat following the successful Ukrainian defense of the capital. They did not get to rest long as they were quickly redeployed to various conflicts along Ukraine's eastern front. Their devastated forces were meshed together to compensate for the casualties they suffered. However, the location change did little to hide their diminished capabilities. As confirmed by local sources, estimates for casualties put the losses for VDV forces active in Ukraine at around 50% as of April. BBC placed confirmed deaths of VDV forces at just under 1,700 men in April 2023. British intelligence has tracked VDV forces acting in a limited capacity throughout Donetsk, Luhansk, and southern Kherson. Recently, Moscow has indicated that VDV troops supported Wagner operations. However, they were relegated to act as a blocking force, indicating how much the Wagner PMC has taken over aspects of heavy fighting. It is a Russian tradition to push units to the edge of defeat before their withdrawal, as indicated by Wagner's leadership's own complaints about supplies and support and their desire to withdraw to camps back in Russia following the capture of Bakhmut to reorganize. These plans echo the situation the VDV forces went through following their failed offensive in northern Ukraine. Recently, Russia has started to emphasize the VDV's new role in the war, highlighting the return of popular General Colonel Mikhail Teplinsky to the front after he was sidelined in January. They also indicated that airborne forces would now have access to TOS-1A thermobaric rocket launchers, fulfilling the Russian requirement that they highlight some new Wunderwaffen whenever they announce some further military action. Perhaps the best indication of how Russia's self-proclaimed elite forces have been diminished is photos coming from the 31st Guards Regiment hometown. Family members posted pictures to local social media of flower-covered graves and shared their suffering at having lost so many young men.